Abby Kugathasan was listening in with me as well as we heard those leaders make their introductory remarks. From the U.S. President, Abby, what stood out for you?
Heather, President Biden there saying that the eastern flank is on the front lines of this conflict. As you mentioned, he reaffirmed the United States' commitment to Article 5. That's certainly something that the Bucharest Nine want to hear, that the Washington will absolutely stay committed to Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all, and that the U.S. would come to the aid of its allies. He also reiterated something that he said yesterday in Warsaw in that historic speech, that this isn't just about Ukraine, but about freedom as well. Now, the Bucharest Nine, all NATO members now, but they were once either part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact. And of course, deep concern among some of those nations that if President Putin finds success in his invasion of Ukraine, he will turn his troops and his tanks on them. And so we've seen a very strong support for Kyiv out of Warsaw, out of Tallinn, out of Riga. Poland, of course, aside from taking in more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees in the last year, has consistently pressed NATO allies to do more. All that talk of fighter jets and tanks very early on, we heard that coming out of Warsaw. And smaller nations like Estonia showing just how critical this war is to their own national defense. Estonia is pledging to spend about half of its own defense budget on aiding Ukraine. That's more than 1% of its GDP. Prime Minister Kaja Kallas didn't speak there, but earlier said that they wanted to hear the U.S. reiterate that support for Article 5, which we just heard from President Biden. And so they're hearing what they wanted to hear from the president. We heard from the president of Slovakia saying just Joe Biden's presence here alone was a show of support for the alliance, certainly something that the president in Russia doesn't want to see, Heather.
So, Abby, that is the Warsaw story so far. I want to bring in some pictures here because this is a day of dueling diplomacy, of parallel presidential messaging, if you will. Here is Vladimir Putin as he appeared earlier this morning at a pro-war rally in Moscow. What have we been seeing in the Russian capital today?
Certainly that event taking place there at Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow. It was the site of the 28 World Cup final, as some of our viewers may remember. But today, a site of another massive rally where he hailed Russian troops fighting in the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. And he led chants of Russia, Russia a short while ago as well. But earlier, he met with China's top diplomat, Yang Wi. President Putin said they'll solidify bilateral ties further, while Yang said other nations can't impact their relationship. Now, they've extended their trade relationship in recent months, and they'll hold joint military drills in South Africa on Friday. And just before the wide-scale invasion last year, it's worth noting their relationship, they hailed it as one with no limits. But certainly messaging can be confusing. Beijing has called for peace in this war. It has called for nuclear threats. It's called out nuclear threats that were being made in this war. But analysts say this does not mean that China is neutral in this war, and it does not mean that China wants to see Ukraine emerge victorious. I spoke with Alicja Bachulska with the European Council on Foreign Relations, who says the West sometimes hears what it wants to hear out of Beijing. Let's have a listen.
I think that's crucial, that we really have to understand what China means when it says something, because it does sound very attractive. If you hear China saying, we want peace, we want the war to stop, we don't want any more people to die. But implicitly, by framing the war in Ukraine in the way it has been doing, China is basically legitimizing Russia's talking point.
In recent days, we've heard U.S. Secretary General Antony Blinken say Washington believes Beijing is getting set to provide the Kremlin with military aid. Beijing denies this. China calls this a proxy war between the West and Russia, fueled by American imperialism via NATO's expansion. And we know that's exactly how the Kremlin sees it. Ms. Bachulska says China can accept a Moscow that is weakened by this war, but it does not want to see Russia lose outright. She also says Beijing has been surprised surprised by the West's unified reaction to Moscow's invasion, but she says that it's far too early and would be very speculative to predict how this Western response could impact China's next steps when it comes to Taiwan. Now, we heard President Putin say he looks forward to a visit from President Xi. It's not clear if that's been set in terms of a date right now, but we do know that President Xi will give a speech tomorrow on Ukraine. Experts say do not expect a peace plan, but rather an outline, Heather, on China's position on the war.